So I'm going to give a presentation now, and this is a presentation I've been working on for about 30 days or so, and it's been a fun one. And it's a little bit of a winding road, and I think my goal for this presentation is at the end of it for you to think to yourselves, I don't know what the heck that was, but I liked it. That's the goal. And this presentation is going to be a bit of a history lesson, but it's not a history lesson into investing, it's not a history lesson into stock picking, it's actually a history lesson into fighting and combat. And I'm just curious, do we have any boxing fans or UFC fans or mixed martial arts fans in the audience? Okay, I think I see a few. And I think even if you didn't raise your hand, I think that's almost in our DNA as human beings to be intrigued with combat and fighting. You know, humans have been fighting since the beginning of time. And the styles of fighting have evolved over the generations, and it really depends on where you are from, whether that's, you know, Asia or the US or South America. But I know it's hard to tell what's on this screen, but it's actually three people wrestling. And this is a cave drawing that dates back 15,000 years that was found in France. And wrestling represents one of the oldest forms of fighting. Literary references to wrestling occur as early as the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 32, the stories of two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Jacob stole a blessing from their father that was meant for their brother, and Jacob is said to have wrestled day and night with an unnamed man that is later revealed to be God. In the Iliad, Homer recounts in the Trojan War in the 13th century, mentions wrestling several times, and wrestling actually appeared in the modern Olympic Games for the very first time as Greco-Roman wrestling in 1896 in Athens. Boxing is thought to have originated back in 1650 BC when the painting, which is up on the screen, was found depicting two young men fighting with gloves on their hands. But it wasn't until 1743 when Jack Broughton used the term boxing for the very first time. And it's why he is called the father of boxing. He actually created the first rules. I think the first rules were like no eye gouging and no punching your opponent when they're down the mat, things like that. Kung Fu originated around the 10th century BC in China. Over several hundred years, you know, several different styles emerged, such as Shaolin Kung Fu and Tai Chi. Karate was an offshoot of Shaolin Kung Fu and was invented in the 1600s in Okinawa, Japan, and didn't spread to mainland Japan until the early 1900s. Now there's 4 major fighting styles of karate that are practiced around the world. Muay Thai, also known as Thai boxing, it originated in Thailand in 657 AD, and Muay Thai resembles American kickboxing, mainly two fighters fighting using punches, kicks, sweeps, elbows. Taekwondo is a martial art developed in the 1940s by a Korean martial artist that is a combination of karate and the Chinese martial arts. Sumo is the Japanese style of wrestling that was invented in the early 1600s. Matches were first organized to raise money to do renovation projects on temples and shrines. And it was actually sumo that led to over 20 grappling martial arts to be invented. Then these grappling martial arts use ground movements, submissions, and throws against their opponents. And 2 of these grappling martial arts are judo and JiuJitsu. And it's actually Japanese JiuJitsu, which was the fighting style of the samurai when the samurais lost their swords on the battlefield. And then by the late 1800s, there was actually 2,000 of these JiuJitsu schools throughout Japan. But today, these grappling martial arts, like JiuJitsu, are viewed by many as the most usable martial arts compared to the standing martial arts like Kung Fu or karate. And you might ask yourself, why? Well, it's because 90% of real-world fights end on the ground with grappling. You know, a few fights involve, you know, 2 people standing toe-to-toe, exchanging punches and kicks. The grappling martial arts are just seen as more usable. And today, most consider the most dominant grappling martial art to be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And a big part of this presentation is kind of going over exactly how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was invented, because it's an incredible story, and also how it ended up being the dominant one over the next 100 years. And at the end of this, I'll tell you what the heck this has to do about stock picking. Mitsuyo Maeda was born in Japan in 1878. He studied sumo at an early age, and he joined the Kodokan Judo Institute at the age of 18. And the Kodokan Institute was actually founded by the founder of judo, and When Maida showed up on the doorstep, he was so frail, so small that the great teacher thought he was actually the paper boy. But he would develop into a great fighter, and about 10 years later, he would travel to the United States to do exhibitions at Princeton University and also the US military. And after that, he would travel to Cuba, to Mexico, Latin America, doing demonstrations with an open invitation to anyone that would challenge him to a fight. And in judo, a throw is a takedown. You basically grab your opponent, you get them off balance, and you take them to the ground, or a throw. And what he would do at these exhibitions is he would pay someone the equivalent of $50 if they could take him down, and he would pay them $250 if he couldn't take them down. And so he would travel around doing these exhibitions, and people would challenge him. And in Brazil, he made his way down to Brazil in 1915, and in Brazil, he would be part of this traveling circus that would go from town to town. And it was actually at one of these stops in 1917 where a 15-year-old Brazilian boy named Carlos Gracie would see one of these demonstrations for the very first time. And this young boy was so kind of enamored with this fighting style that allowed smaller opponents to take down men that were twice his size. And this demonstration so impacted the young boy that it changed not only the Gracie family tree for generations, but also would change combat sports for the next 100 years. Maida would stay in Brazil for 2 years, and Carlos Gracie would train under him. And Carlos Gracie is seen on the left, and his brother Helio Gracie is seen on the right. And Carlos Gracie would open up the first jiu-jitsu academy in Brazil in 1925. And Helio, his brother on the right, would become his first student. And it's actually Helio Gracie who would train and refine his skills, and Helio was the smaller of the two. And Helio would develop a new fighting style called Gracie JiuJitsu that kind of used leverage and technique over brute strength. And just this ability to take down men that were twice your size really led to this massive reputation and explosion in Brazilian jiu-jitsu in Brazil and then later throughout the world. And in this picture, you see Helio Gracie in the center holding a baby. You see Carlos Gracie standing right above him in the middle of the picture holding another child. And one could say that these two brothers, Carlos and Helio Gracie, the two things they excelled at were fighting and having children. Because between 1932 and 1968, Helio and Carlos fathered 30 children. Helio had 9 sons, and Carlos had 21 children. Each one of their sons learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from an early age. And so is it really a surprise that these sons, these brothers, these cousins would become some of the best fighters in the world, several of them becoming world champions? From the 1930s to the 1990s, the Gracie family's sole purpose was to spread Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu across the world. The patriarchs of the family, Carlos and Helio Gracie, used their offspring similarly to how Jesus used his disciples, spreading the gospel through miracles, but instead he used his sons by fighting across the world and setting up trading centers. And this Gracie Jiu-Jitsu just spread rapidly, a fighting style that allowed smaller individuals to defeat larger opponents. And it's actually Rickson Gracie, one of Helio's older sons. He's the little boy seen in the upper right photograph that grew up to be the best fighter in the family. This is a picture of Rickson Gracie at the age of 20. He started training at age 2. He was teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by the age of 12. By the age of 20, Rickson Gracie was creating a lot of buzz throughout Brazil. Many of the professional fighters in Brazil didn't like the buzz he was getting because Rickson wasn't a professional fighter, although it was said that Rickson was 300-0 by the time he was 18. And also, can you imagine looking like this guy? He's 6'2", 180 pounds. He looks like a Brazilian Brad Pitt from Fight Club or something. I mean, can you imagine looking like this and also being the best fighter in the world? He's probably didn't lack confidence. So in 1979, the most famous professional fighter in Brazil, a man named Ray Zulu, who was 140-0, challenged the young 20-year-old Rickson Gracie to a match who never had a professional fight before. Zulu was 240 pounds compared to Rickson's 180 pounds. The fight was televised throughout Brazil. There were over 20,000 people attended this fight live. Rickson defeated Zulu to become the world champion. And one of the things that makes jiu-jitsu so respected is the honor in the sport. The best in the sport are challenged constantly. It's not like boxing where you have one boxing match once per year and it's on to the next one. literally on a weekly basis, you can just walk into one of these guys' gyms and kind of challenge them to spar or fight, and it needs to be accepted. It's sort of the honor in the sport. And it's how Rickson was 300-0 by the time he was 20. So in 1979, Rickson Gracie becomes the world champion. And this is where Chuck Norris enters the picture. This is a great story. Soon after the Gracie Zulu fight in 1979, it was probably about a year later, Chuck Norris gets a hold of the recording of this fight. And he was so impressed with Rickson's performance that he did some due diligence into Rickson and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and found out that their main training center was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So what do you think Chuck Norris decided to do? He decided to take his next vacation in Rio de Janeiro. Now, Chuck Norris wasn't a slouch. He wasn't a phony fighter. He didn't just fight in the movies. He was a 6-time international karate champion. He wasn't a phony action star, and it's a big reason why Bruce Lee cast him in Enter the Dragon in 1968, which is where this photo was taken from. But now it's 1980, and Chuck Norris just got done filming the movie The Octagon. And so in 1980, this is exactly what Chuck Norris looked like, a physical specimen, as you can tell. And it's exactly the same time that he decides to take his vacation down to Brazil so he could visit the Gracies at their main training center. And again, this is like walking into the lion's den. You know, the biggest killers in the sport are training at this training center. And so as the story goes, Chuck Norris goes down to Brazil so he could go into the Gracie's training center. He sees Helio Gracie, again, the father of Rickson Gracie, also the father of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in this training center. He walks up to him. He asks him if he could train there for the day, and Helio says, sure, you can train here. And Norris says, great. He's like, where's Rickson at? And so Rickson was training somebody in the back of the training center. Chuck Norris walks up to Rickson, yells out his name, Rickson, let's go. And can you imagine? I was just laughing about this the other day. The greatest fighter in the world training somebody on the mat, and you look up and you see Chuck Norris, who probably looked like a movie poster, yelling at you, challenging you to a fight. And so Rickson looks at his father, Helio. Helio gives him a nod of approval to go ahead. And so in 1980, Chuck Norris challenges the greatest fighter in the world to a fight. And this is a true story, by the way. What do you think happened? Well, this is what Chuck Norris had to say about it. I was a black belt in judo, so I thought I had some pretty good grappling skills. I got on the ground with Rickson Gracie, and it was like I'd never had a lesson in my life. He played with me. He actually choked him out in about 45 seconds. And this photo is actually Rickson choking him out, which is pretty funny. And you would think that the Gracies would think Chuck Norris was some sort of moron. You know, who's this white guy coming down from the U.S., coming to our home turf, challenging us? But the Gracies actually loved it. You know, they actually later call him the Lion just for his fearlessness. And it would actually form a mutual respect between Chuck Norris and the Gracies that would last for decades. And Chuck Norris himself would later become a third-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But soon after that occurrence in 1980, Rickson Gracie left that summer for Japan. And he went to Japan and basically beat up on everybody in Japan. He spent about 3 years there. And then he set his sights on the United States. And between the late 1980s and the early 1990s, he did over 100 private exhibition matches. And many of these exhibitions were never seen by the public. Most of them were never seen except for the person he was fighting against. But he basically just traveled around to different gyms, training centers, and just challenged people. And I can only imagine it kind of being a fighter at that point in time, it had to have been like Kaiser Sose walking into your gym and you just knew you were going to get your butt kicked. And that's basically what he did. And in one of these legendary private exhibitions, Rickson Gracie challenged Mark Schultz. Schultz was a 2-time NCAA wrestling champion, a 2-time world champion, and he won Olympic gold a few years prior. Rickson and Schultz met up on the mats at a BYU campus. And this is what Mark Schultz had to say about this match because there was nobody else in the room. Rickson Gracie and me had a match at the BYU wrestling room in 1992. He made me tap out twice and told me I was the toughest guy he'd ever gone against. Talk about a backhanded compliment. Rickson was the best fighter I'd ever seen. While Rickson was destroying opponents in private exhibitions, his brother Rorian Gracie was dreaming up a new championship called the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or the UFC for short, and which of course is now the largest combat sport venue in the world. But the original premise of the UFC was to actually showcase Gracie Jiu-Jitsu against all known fighting styles in the world. And the first iteration of the UFC was to be a single one-day tournament. And back then, there were few tournaments where different fighting styles were allowed to fight against each other. Normally boxers fight against boxers, judo against judo, karate against karate. And I think what you'll find is the rules of each fighting style sort of protect its deficiencies as well. And so this siloed off nature of the martial arts kind of leaves people with this open question of, well, which fighting style is the best? And who is the best fighter in that fighting style? And up until the early 1990s, few people have seen Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that was about to change. In UFC 1, which took place on November 12, 1993, Helio Gracie sent his youngest son, Royce Gracie, to the U.S. to fight in UFC 1. They didn't send Rickson, they sent Royce, and Royce did an interview about a year ago, and he said that he was actually the worst fighter in the family. He never even had a professional bout before UFC 1, and I think Helio did that for a reason. I think he wanted to basically show that their worst fighter can beat your best fighter. And what is even more interesting about UFC 1 is Helio gave his son Royce a specific set of instructions. He said that he was to win, but he was to win without hurting or injuring his opponents. Helio wanted the world to see the purity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Helio knew that if people saw a smaller man dominate a larger man and not even hurt them, it would attract a lot of people into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. UFC 1 would prove out Gracie's vision. Royce Gracie would go undefeated and took down opponents twice his size, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would erupt in popularity. And in UFC 2, Royce Gracie came back and went undefeated again. And this was the mid-1990s. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu boomed around this time, and this is when Royce and Rickson Gracie's cousin, Renzo Gracie, set up the Renzo Gracie Academy in New York City. And this is when a man named John Danaher walked in as one of the first students at the Renzo Gracie Academy. And John Danaher is pretty much the last character in our story in this presentation. John Danaher grew up in New Zealand. His father was an Air Force pilot. Danaher was born with deformed patellas, making him prone to knee injuries. He had several knee injuries and surgeries on them when he was younger, and I think it left one of his legs shorter than the other, and he wasn't able to become a professional fighter, but it didn't stop him from learning Muay Thai and karate. And so he's always been a cerebral human being. And he loves thinking, and he loves thinking about thinking. He got his bachelor's degree in philosophy. And then he got his master's degree in philosophy. And then he came to the U.S. to pursue his PhD in philosophy at Columbia University in 1991. And it's while he was studying at Columbia, he became obsessed with weightlifting, and he put on about 40 pounds of muscle. He's about 5'9", 240 pounds. And because he knew how to defend himself, he knew some Muay Thai and karate, he actually got a job as a bouncer at a nightclub in the evenings to earn extra money so he could pay for his PhD. And everything changed when Danaher's friend and roommate at Columbia, who was 60 pounds lighter than him, challenged him to a match on their apartment floor. And his roommate defeated him in about 30 seconds, and he was stunned. And quite honestly, this is the normal introduction of most people to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's somebody that thinks they know how to fight, finally goes up against somebody that knows Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and they're taken down with such ease that it startles them. It's alarming. And then they're hooked, and then they start training. And this is exactly what John Danaher did and how he was lured into the sport. Today, John Danaher is considered the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts instructor in the world. He's in the center of the screen. He's coached some of the best athletes in the sport, including St. Pierre, who's on the left. He's considered the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. He's trained Gordon Ryan, who's on the right, who's considered the greatest submission grappler of all time. Danaher is called the Einstein of Jiu-Jitsu because of how deeply he thinks about combat and innovating and finding new ways for his students to defeat opponents. And you can actually find several interviews with John Danaher on the Lex Friedman podcast, on the Joe Rogan podcast. They're 3 hours long, and they're really, really interesting to listen to. I would compare listening to John Danaher like listening to Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett. It doesn't take you long to realize there's a significant amount of horsepower in that brain, a lot more than the average human. To give you an example, a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, John Danaher was on a podcast with Lex Friedman, and he was asked this funny question, and he didn't know this question was coming beforehand. He was asked, in a fight between a gorilla, a lion, and a grizzly bear, who would win that fight? And it's a silly question, right? You can't help but, smile a little bit or chuckle to yourself when you hear a question that's stupid. And, you can pull up this segment on YouTube, and it has over 1.5 million views. And you might be asking yourself, why does this segment have 1.5 million views? Well, it's because Danaher's answer is 37 minutes long. And I'm not going to play the whole clip for you, but you should listen to it when you have time. And you go into this question, you go into this clip thinking this is a joke of a question, it's going to be a joke of an answer, but it isn't. John Danaher cites research, academic studies, talks about the hunting patterns of each animal, the aggression and behavioral tendencies of each animal, the bite force of each animal, the stamina, the fighting experience each animal has in the wild. He talks about why a lion is the most ferocious and how male lions fight to the death for the right to lead their pride. And when one male lion fights another, it doesn't end until one of them dies. But it goes further than that. When two male lions fight, they aren't just fighting for their own lives, but the lives of their children. When two male lions are fighting, when the one male dies, the winning lion will then kill all the male offspring. So when these two male lions are fighting, they're basically fighting for their entire bloodline. Half of all male lions will die in their first year because their fathers lost a fight. And this is why male lions fight with such fury. And it's answers like this that kind of draw you into this segment. You get hooked to these answers because it's one after another. And it's just wild because he didn't know this question was coming beforehand, but he already did the research into these animals. And it's probably because he was just studying animal, fighting patterns so he could become a better coach to his students. And, isn't that sort of what a master does with their craft? Thinking deeply about the things that are somewhat related to their craft that only others would laugh at. It kind of reminds me a bit of a story that John Madden tells. And as many of you know, John Madden was a legendary football coach for the Oakland Raiders between 1969 and 1978. And in 9 seasons, the Raiders made the playoffs 8 times. They won 7 division titles, and they won a Super Bowl. Madden actually still holds the highest winning percentage among NFL coaches who have coached more than 100 games. But Madden wasn't always fanatical about coaching. Prior to becoming an NFL coach, he was an assistant coach at San Diego State, and he tells this story about when he was an assistant coach there, how he saw that the legendary coach Vince Lombardi was doing a coaching clinic in Reno, Nevada, and he ended up spending all of his life savings so he could just go to this coaching clinic put on by the great Vince Lombardi. And this is a great quote from John Madden on this experience. "I went up there and Vince Lombardi spoke on one play for 8 hours. One play, 8 hours. I couldn't speak on a subject for more than 2 minutes. I realized at that moment I didn't know a damn thing. I was a phony. My knowledge was just surface knowledge. I knew nothing about the game of football." And that experience would change John Madden's life forever. And he started truly studying the game, and he became fanatical about football. It also reminded me of Frank Perdue. And many of you probably know Frank Perdue, even though he passed away almost 20 years ago, but as the Chicken Man, you can just his face, you kind of know who he is. And Frank Perdue took Perdue Farms from a single chicken farm into one of the largest producers of chicken in the world and one of the biggest brands in the world. Frank died in 2005, and Frank's widow, Mitzi Perdue, wrote this great book up here on the screen, and I'd encourage you to read it. But when Sean Iddings and I were doing our research into the Intelligent Fanatics books that we wrote in 2016 and 2017, we actually reached out to Mitzi Perdue and had a couple conversations with her at that point in time. And I would consider Frank Perdue sort of the Sam Walton of chicken. He was just a cerebral, quantitative, engineering type of deep thinker. He thought really hard about every decision he was making. And Mitzi told us about this is a cool story, but Mitzi told us about Frank Perdue. People would often ask him about his success and how he became so successful. And Mitzi said when a person would ask Frank how he became so successful, he would kind of shrug him off and just say, I was in the right place at the right time. And then when somebody would push him a little bit further, he would then say, I had some great people around me. And then, if somebody really pushed him further, like, cut the bullshit. How did he become so successful? If he was at his desk and sitting in his chair, he would turn in his chair and point up to a picture frame on the wall with this quote from Alexander Hamilton. Men give me credit for some genius. All the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, I study it profoundly. Day and night, it is before me. My mind becomes pervaded with it. Then the effort that I have made is what people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. And whether it's John Danaher, Vince Lombardi, or John Madden, or Frank Perdue, the greats of the game study the game they are playing at levels that are miles below the surface of the competition. When you hear somebody like John Danaher give such an eloquent, well-thought-out answer to a ridiculous question about gorillas, lions, and bears, you know he's probably thought even deeper about more applicable questions. Danaher was asked, "How do you become the best in the world at what you do?" And he replied, "Any sport or profession has 5 or 6 core skills that are necessary to participate. And to be the best in the world, you must be good at all the skills, but you need to be the best in the world in at least 1 or 2 of those skills." And so it got me thinking, what are the skills of stock picking? I'm not talking about talents. Talents are gifts you're born with. I'm talking about skills, which are things you can learn and develop into strengths. There are many different flavors of stock picking. As you and I all know, I'm sure there's 50 different flavors sitting in this room, from coffee canning to day trading, from fundamental to momentum to deep value to hypergrowth. But in the end, I don't think it matters. I think there's 6 universal skills to stock picking, and I'm going to go through each one really quickly because the purpose of this presentation isn't for you to invest like me, it's for you to invest like you. But the first skill is identifying. Finding actionable ideas before others. And I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago on Microcap Club. But a big part of identifying ideas is knowing what you were looking for and doing nothing until you find it. But it also means utilizing all the methods of idea generation at your disposal, like brute force research, screening, just networking, relationships. And I think we all know people that are exceptional at finding ideas before others. They always seem to be one step ahead of you or others. Or maybe you are one of these individuals that finds ideas before others. And you probably know the other 3 or 4 other people that are like you that invest in your same flavor of investing, that you'll always seem to find the ideas at the same time. But what is interesting is just because you're exceptional at finding ideas, it doesn't mean you're great at the other skills. The curiosity, the energy, the drive to discover something new doesn't always translate into the other skills. When Christopher Columbus discovered America, he wasn't the best person to set up the trade routes, set up the towns or infrastructure. These were separate, distinct skills, and so are the other skills of stock picking. The next skill is valuation, determining intrinsic value. A big part of winning big is losing small, and when you're looking at a new idea, when you're looking at valuation, kind of looking down before you look up. And it's easy to forget that to find a multi-bagger, a stock that goes up 10, 20, 30x, it's a combination of earnings growth and multiple expansion. The price you pay is important, but valuation goes far beyond assessing cheapness. Depending on your flavor of investing, you also need to evaluate the quality level of the management team or the business. And a big part of valuation is bringing together all the evidence and forming an estimate or a vision of what that business can become in 3 to 5 years and valuing that today. And valuation is a skill because you can develop that skill. You get better at analyzing quality in businesses and people over time. The next skill is buying or sizing your conviction. This could be initial position sizing, averaging up or averaging down. Choosing the right stocks is about probably less than half the battle. Most of your future returns will be dictated by your position sizing. Especially in small stocks like microcaps, each business is at a different maturity and robustness. There's microcaps, as that are 10-person operations and some that have 200 employees. There's some that have management depth and some that are run by 2 people. There's some that have not a very good board and others that have a great board. And I think when amateurs talk about position sizing, they mainly mean taking larger positions. When great stock pickers talk about position sizing, they mean constantly tracking the intrinsic value against the market value and comparing those to everything they own and everything they want to own. The next skill is holding or maintenance due diligence, knowing what you own at all times. Andy Grove said only the paranoid survive, and that's probably the best advice to any microcap investor. And as conviction investors, you must stay on top of your positions. You can't take your eye off the ball, especially with small stocks, because they're small businesses. And holding means anchoring your decisions to the right things and not being distracted by the wrong things, forming extreme conviction when the stock's trading below your assessment of intrinsic value. Maintenance due diligence is incredibly important because small businesses evolve, they change, and oftentimes it's not for the better, it can be for the worse. And even microcap success stories, a lot of them don't deserve to be held for over 10 years. They have a winning season of 2 or 3 years. Holding is a difficult skill to learn because it changes with every single position. Holding can mean 3 months, holding can mean 30 years, or anything in between. Selling. Selling is the skill of letting go. And for me, it means ruthlessly adhering to my principles and process. When you think about selling, you ultimately sell a stock for 4 main reasons. The first 2 reasons to sell mean something good happened. The stock went up too far, too fast, or you found something better than the worst thing you own. The last 2 reasons you sell are because something bad happened. The business stopped performing, it changed for the worse, or management has proven themselves to be untrustworthy or incompetent. And this is where investing with principles really matters, and ruthlessly selling when those principles are broken. Selling is the skill of letting go. The 6th and final skill of stock picking, might be the most important. Howard Marks has this great quote, it's up on the screen. There are old investors, there are bold investors, but there are no old, bold investors. And I found as stock pickers, our boldness gets scared out of us as we age. All the random gut shots you take, the black swan events, the losses you take in the portfolio, they take their toll on you over the decades, emotionally and psychologically. Remember that saying, I think it was from the movie The Unusual Suspects, that when you dance with the devil doesn't change, the devil changes you. I think you can replace devil with the stock market. When you dance with the stock market doesn't change, the stock market changes you. And you see it regularly in stock pickers. It's why most stock pickers after 20, 30, 40 years, their portfolios all look like the same type of boring. Over time, the market scares all the risk out of them, scares all the boldness out of them. The last multi-bagger they had was 15 years ago. They stopped being courageous, they stopped evolving, they stopped growing. And it's why the last and final skill of stock picking is survival. And the key to survival is staying hungry, never being satisfied, not slowing down. Inside every stock picker is a better stock picker. And the downfall, quite honestly, of every stock picker is when you stand still, or even worse, you keep rereading old chapters of your life and you stop writing new ones. And so these are the 6 skills of stock picking. And just like John Danaher said, it's important to be good at all 6 of these skills. But if you want to be in the top 1% of 1%, you must not only be good at every skill, but you must be world class in at least 1, hopefully 2 of these skills. And I think when you look at the best stock pickers in the world, they often do 1 or 2 of these skills extraordinarily well when you really think about it. And to go a step further, I think the best stock pickers tend to innovate on these skills as well. And they also innovate in a way that goes counter to what most people believe. I think if you've put up a good track record for over 10 years, I would argue your advantage are in the areas and skills that you are unique, not the same as other investors. The purpose of this presentation was to get all of you to think about the skills of stock picking and the skills where you're deficient, the skills where you're gifted, and in the areas you are deficient, try to fill those gaps with tools or resources or people so you can be good at them. In the areas you're gifted, lean into those areas hard and become the best in the world. Thank you.